Well, welcome today to Prophetic Perspectives, where we address current events from a prophetic perspective. I'm Chris Reed, and of course I'm joined by Rick Joyner.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's always good to be with you and to share this time and space with you. I tell you, as usual, we pray that these programs bless you, and maybe consider telling your friends and family about it, to tune in and watch it. If this is being a blessing to you, we pray that you'll consider letting others know. You know, recently we saw this real surge in the Omicron virus, and I think a lot of people got it. A lot of people got it and didn't know they had it, and then a lot of people got it and tested and found out, that they did have it. But of course, as normal politicians, I think, do, there was an attempt by Biden to not address it, to not talk about it. In fact, a lot of people were saying, how come he's not addressing this surge? Because the news was saying 1.5 million cases a day were being reported. Now, if a conservative had been president and 1.5 million cases were being reported a day, there would be a media meltdown. But the fact of the matter is, when this was recently happening, the president went to Atlanta and gave a speech about the filibuster in the Senate. Now, of course, Joe Biden was a senator from Delaware for, nearly 40 years or something like that.
A long time.
A long time. And it's so interesting to listen to some of these politicians who are in high levels of power say things different than what they did for the previous 40 years before that. Our form of government and our founders, although they may have been imperfect men, Rick, they were geniuses. I mean, the older I get and the more I study their writings, and they were absolute geniuses. And I know the Constitution wasn't inspired like the Bible was inspired, but I believe it was divinely influenced.
I think it was divinely inspired, just not on a biblical level.
Sure. But along the lines, of course, we have the Congress, we have the Senate, we have the presidency, and then, of course, we have the Supreme Court. One of the principles our founders really, in the founding of our nation, the establishing of our government, they intentionally made it difficult with the lower and the upper chamber, the House of Representatives, and then, of course, the Senate being the upper chamber. They intentionally made it hard to change major things easy.
That's hard for us in this day and age to understand.
It is.
They wanted it to go slow.
They did.
Because you're affecting the whole country with these laws. You got to process it. You want to think through every possible flaw in this thing. They wanted to put the brakes on change. And they wanted change, but they wanted to be something that was proven or had a clear understanding of where we're going before it could become a law.
Yeah, and they wanted the vast majority of the citizens to want it, which is the reason why in the House of Representatives, the lower chamber, it's easier to pass legislation. You see this play out, on a regular basis. Anytime a new bill's being taken up, all you need really is the simple majority. I think it's 218 votes. But when it goes to the Senate, of course, they will debate and make changes and all of that. But the filibuster, the rules of the Senate, the filibuster is basically, they wanted there to be 60 votes. There's always 100 senators, 2 senators per state, and 60 votes to pass legislation. I believe it was back about 7 or 8 years ago. Harry Reid, when he was the majority leader, actually nuked the filibuster when it came to approving judges. But I think, if I remember correct me if I'm wrong, everything else that goes to the Senate remained with the filibuster. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because, a lot of people, when the energy over the last number of years has seemed to be on the progressive left, because it's easy to be energetic when you're fighting or believing for things to be different. But when you're conservative, Judeo-Christian valued Americans, yeah, there's little things that can be changed here and there, But we pretty much like our nation. We like the founding principles. We like our form of government. It's the best current form of government on the earth. And so the filibuster, the 60-vote requirement, has been recently a major issue. And President Biden came out and basically said, listen, we're not going to get anything passed because, there's been 50 Republicans in the Senate, 50 Democrats. It's 50-50. And you can't pass anything, if you don't, with this deadlock, this gridlock of partisan politics. Parties pretty much don't cross over the line to vote with other parties. And so he gives this speech here a few weeks ago in Atlanta. And basically, he actually said this: if you supported keeping the filibuster, in other words, requiring the 60-vote threshold so that major change is hard to do, because you don't want to drop it to 50, because that means every time you change a majority, you can just flip-flop back on major laws.
The whiplash will destroy a nation.
The whiplash, that's a good way. Thank you for saying that. The whiplash will literally destroy the nation. I mean, think about it. If it took 50 votes to pass something like in recent years like Obamacare, and just say 51 senators voted for it on the Democrat side as a simple majority, and then the Republicans 2 years later take control back of the Senate, they could vote 51 to undo all of it.
Exactly.
So what you get into is a major amount of underwriting and legislation, and money that goes involved with changing these things. So to summarize my point, it basically boils down to this. Joe Biden, who was against breaking the filibuster for years, basically said, if you didn't support him in changing it now, then you basically was, Jim Crow 2.0. I think he actually even made those references.
Yeah. The hyperbole coming from the left is bizarre. I mean, it's gone over the top. And they think that it's winning people. It's losing people.
Yeah.
People are starting to look at them as being insane, unhinged. These people may be wrong, but they're not Hitler. They're not Stalin. They're not, and things like, wanting to do away or keep the filibuster, it does not make you a racist. Now, conservative has been defined as someone who wants change, but they want it proven, and they want clarity about where you're going with this change and what the impact is going to be. Everybody wants to see the poor fit. Who is not for, doing away with hunger in the world?
Yeah.
Sickness, child abuse, all that. Conservatives want that as much or more, but they want it done wisely, done in a way that actually gets done. It's probably 30 years ago when I read a study. I've got to look it up and find and get my dates right, but where they studied several government agencies and found out that only 10% of the money given to these government agencies, I think one of them was HUD, and only 10% of the money given to that agency actually made it to a need. 90% was being consumed in the bureaucracy. Now, I think it's probably much less now, actually. There's so many things, government does not manage things well. Now, I know Christians who are saying, but God commanded us to take care of the poor. That's exactly right. He commanded us. Nowhere does he command the government to do it. And when the government tries to do what God gave us the responsibility to do, it's going to mess it up. It is going to mess it up, and it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be efficient. Now we're pouring trillions of dollars into programs, and nothing's being accomplished. So that's I think the definition of conservative. No, we want these things too. We just want to do it right. And I think that's one of the reasons why the founders had such incredible wisdom to only give authority in these three areas to the federal government because the states are going to do education much better than the federal government. It's their kids. They're going to see the impact. They're going to feel the results of anything that goes awry. They're going to see what works and what doesn't. And states also had the freedom, if they didn't like what other states were doing, they could do it differently. And pretty soon everybody's going to judge the fruit.
Yeah.
Okay, you did it differently. What is the fruit from that? And then other states could choose, and it brings about a natural process of change. I'm Rick Joyner. This is my newest book, Marxism's Strategy for Destroying America. I cover in this the 100-year strategy Marxism has had for destroying the United States of America, how it's being implemented, how it's affected every single one of our lives, and how they're about to complete the job, but it can still be stopped. But we have to understand what is in this book. You want to get it. You want to read this. You know, Winston Churchill was one of the most prophetic people, I think, in the all time, in some ways. But one of the things he prophesied about, governments becoming these massive bureaucracies. And he listed that among the things that he prophesied, a number of things, all of which he considered to be threats to humanity. You know, these out-of-control growing bureaucracies, it's like brain cancer on the body of America. The government is the head. But when it grows without control, what cancer is a cell that starts growing without regard to the rest of the body, just consumes for itself. We sat down with a friend of ours who's been dealing with government, consulting with many governments, not just our federal government, for decades, and but we, one day, here on Main Street, one of our offices, we and several other guys, Lance Wallnow, as Mark Nuttall, a few of us got together, and we just evaluated, I think we got to 12 or 15 agencies, and 3 of those existed to counter what other agencies were doing. Now, there are, guess how many agencies there are? You cannot find this from the federal government. You can call the federal government, look everywhere you can. Nobody knows how many agencies there are. But we became convinced it's around 700 federal agencies.
Wow.
Consuming all the resources that should be going to the poor, should be going to healthcare and things like that for people. The federal government's become a big head. And it's got brain cancer. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Well, you know, you mentioned this a minute ago on one of our recent programs. Mm-hmm. We touched on this idea of what our Constitution gives the federal government power for, the 3 things that we've alluded to. And, in talking about the filibuster, the main reason why Biden wants the filibuster now, he didn't for all the years he's been in D.C., but now because he's in power, he's willing to break the filibuster rule that he was against doing for so many years, because one of the major reasons he wants to break it is to pass the voting legislation.
Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, that's been here recently on the docket, which is another example of the federal government trying to take power that the Constitution gives to the states, which is who's counting the votes. Whether the states do it or there's a federal takeover over who's counting
that law, the H.R. 1 is unconstitutional, profoundly unconstitutional, no question about it, and will destroy the republic.
It will, and it's dead on. It's been dead all along, and he knew that. It's not going to happen. They're not going to be able to get the filibuster through, and obviously they're not going to get this federalization of our elections done. But isn't it interesting, Rick, how that this has been the recent focus of the administration? Instead of addressing things like, the real crises like inflation, the COVID pandemic, the southern border, violent crime, Russia's action in Europe right now. Instead, they've become consumed by some bizarre panic over election laws.
Well, they know that will keep them in power. They will lose the next election so big.
Yep.
They may never win another one again if they don't change the rules to favor them and to disfavor the conservatives. They've got to change the rules of the game, or they don't have much of a chance to win for a long time to come, if ever again.
Yeah,
and they know that. They have ticked off America. They have really ticked off America.
That's right. And I'll tell you that the hypocrisy of the left right now. Let me give you an example. Since we're talking about, the voting laws and this desire for Biden to change and federalize elections, and he has to address the filibuster to get that done. Let me tell you how bizarre this is, and this might segue us into the next part of our conversation. And isn't it bizarre how this panic, this fake panic over election laws that exists in liberals' minds, and they're so against having an ID to prove who you are to vote. They're so against, they say that's racist, it's immoral to have to prove that you are who you say you are, but yet they want you to prove who you say you are when it comes to a vaccine passport. You have to have ID laws there.
Yeah, you got to have ID to buy cigarettes, to buy liquor, anything.
Yeah.
And that, to call an ID, voter ID, racist, has to be the most offensive thing to our minorities possible. There are several democracies in Africa that are pretty primitive countries. Nowhere near, not even close to being as developed as we are. Every single one of them has voter ID. No one ever questioned. Our UN will not recognize an election that's not voter ID.
Yep.
This is fundamental to knowing who's voting, to being able to record. It's not racist, it's not attack on the minorities. It's got to be absolutely insulting to say in that primitive country, they can get an ID and they can vote, where our minorities are not smart enough to do that. That's what they're saying by that. When they have to have an ID anyway, because you literally cannot buy cigarettes, alcohol, all kinds of things without an ID.
Yep.
And you're right, the hypocrisy of the vaccine.
Passport
and ID. They want you to have one where they want you to have one. But this is the kind of madness. Americans are not as stupid as they're being made out to be by this administration, by the left in general. And I think, many we see by the polls, which I don't believe the polls, I believe they're skewed. I don't believe Biden has anywhere close to a 33% approval
Maybe
rating.
33 people.
Yeah, I mean, you can't find anyone who said they voted for him. Right. You can make a poll say anything you want it to. You can skew, it's easy. You can skew the polls by what you ask in the poll, how you ask it. So I don't put a lot of trust in these, and they've not been trustworthy. They've been really inaccurate. But they want them to be as favorable as they can look towards the left, because that's the agenda of most of these pollsters. So for them to be this bad, think of how bad it really is.
Yeah.
I tell you, America is waking up. They're waking up, and it's not just a political, because politics, may have gotten us into this, but it's not going to get us out. We can never, ever forget that we've got to have a revival in America. We've got to have another great awakening. Because you can change the laws, that doesn't change people. You can make a parrot say what you want it to say and do what you want it to do, but it'll never be in its heart. And, Margaret Thatcher one time said that when she saw the riots in New York, when the lights went out, people went crazy. They became animals. And she said the veneer of civilization is very thin. And it's true.
Yeah.
And right now, we've got to have the laws in our hearts, where if the lights go out and we could do something bad, we won't do it because that bad is not in our heart. God always sees. We live our lives before the living God, not before men. It's not just about laws. So we try to evaluate all these things. We feel like we have to, and we have to speak into them. One main reason we need to do these programs, because so many say their churches, their pastors won't address these things. They want to hear from their Christian leaders what's going on. But, when Jesus comes back, he's not coming back as a Republican. I'm sorry. He's not going to be a Democrat. He's not coming back to take sides. He's coming to take over.
Yeah.
He's the captain of the host. And there's a way, too, that we're going to have to rise above partisan politics to represent him as he is. Thank you for joining us for this prophetic perspectives.
Recently, I was in one of those isolated moments of just sitting before God. And I felt like something was spoken to me. COVID was a speeding ticket. In order for you to appreciate some of the impact that had, I'm going to walk you back into my life about speeding tickets. Probably not unlike a lot of teenagers, I was pretty reckless. And I was particularly reckless driving. And I don't use the word careless, I was reckless. We lived about 60 miles from the Jersey Shore, and every other day in the summer I would pile a whole bunch of kids in the car and we'd be off. And this is a convertible, and this is the time before seatbelts and stuff. And I remember very distinctly the first time a police officer pulled up behind me. And it was not pleasant. But I will tell you, I was somewhat bullheaded. And so while I had our ticket in hand, 48 hours later, I had an additional ticket. In other words, it didn't slow me down. But there was something that happened here that made an impression on me. And I can remember trying to negotiate my way out of the circumstances that I found myself in and appealing to my father for some sort of help. And there was a dead silence. And although my dad was a gracious man, he was going to let me bear the consequences of this mistake, of these mistakes. And it wasn't just one, it was 2 tickets. So I can remember going into the courtroom, and the first thing that I noticed is I was reading one of the tickets, and it had the wrong year on it. And so I thought, perhaps I'm going to avoid the consequences. And I went over to talk to an attorney who wasn't my attorney, and I showed this to him, and he said, you probably could get off on a technicality. And so as soon as I was called before the judge, I mentioned to him this technicality, but he was having none of it. This was one of the greatest impressions that was made on me in my life, and I actually believe that because of the way all of that impacted me, it actually wound up saving my life because I was so reckless. So when I'm getting this message that COVID was a speeding ticket, this was significant to me because it changed aspects of the way that I involved myself in my future and in my life. And I would not get another speeding ticket for 50 years. And perhaps you remember, I remember it pretty clearly, the daily routines that we were forced to change. I do believe God not only used them in a positive way, but He wanted to make imprints on our lives that would significantly alter the way that we do things. And it gave some brain space and soul space for God to operate that He had not had routines continued. Now, I don't think it's a strange thing that for many individuals, we're going through a second round of this COVID stuff. As a matter of fact, just this week, I cleared protocol for the second time with regard to COVID, and I wonder about this thing that Bob Jones used to say. Sometimes you don't prophesy, you are the prophecy. And so here I am reflecting on the impact of 2 speeding tickets. At the same time, I'm reflecting on the impact of 2 rounds of COVID, and the very time that I'm going to be speaking, I'm now being cleared again. And I wonder if some of the impact from the first round of all of those speeding tickets and how it impacted me, God's trying to speak again, that He wants something altered in the way that we're doing things. And I will tell you this, I do believe it's an accurate statement that God wants us to learn from what we're finding ourselves going through, and that we would permanently alter the way that we move forward. God, I do believe, has permitted all this so that His people will respond to the circumstances that we find ourselves in and be drawn into another dimension. I think it's a great privilege of an invitation